Cuba's economy has struggled for years, but the current situation feels especially ominous.
People are scared. People are worried. People read the news and they see aggressive statements coming out of Washington.
I'm Carolyn Kpler.
And I'm Marco Werman. Today, the view from Havana. Also, investors large and small driving up the price of gold.
There's a sense of eternity that's tied up into gold, and I think that's part of its appeal too.
And we go to the heart of the Somali American community in the Twin Cities.
Today we are not gathered out of fear. We're gathered out of love for our neighbors, for our children, and for our future.
We also meet members of the pro-government armed groups in Venezuela who are not thrilled to hear the words from the White House about who is running their country.
All that and more today on The World.
This is The World. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Kpler. Thank you for being here today. Cuba is running out of oil. The island could deplete its entire supply in just 15 to 20 days. That's according to the data company Kpler.
A major factor here is Mexico. President Claudia Sheinbaum has said that Mexico will cut off its shipments of oil to Cuba, but her government might be backtracking on that.
La ayuda humanitaria a Cuba como a otros países continúa.
Sheinbaum now says that humanitarian aid shipments of oil to Cuba will continue. Meanwhile, Cubans are dealing with an economic crisis. Ed Augustin is an independent journalist based in Havana. He told me today that in the city, garbage trucks have stopped coming for the trash.
So a few months ago, I was living in a penthouse in central Havana. I'd have my morning coffee. I'd look out over the balcony, and I'd almost, it sounds a bit off, but admire the huge pile of garbage below. I was lucky not to be able to smell it because I was quite high up. It looks kind of beautiful because it maps with the street, and you've got these pink plastic bags that kind of float around on top, so it almost looks like a work of modern art. You go down there, and it stinks. You see people that live yards away from where it is. We're talking mountains of rubbish that in some cases can take up half a block. If you take a walk in central Havana right now, you will see mounds of trash with flies over them. In Cuba, there are mosquito-borne diseases. It's a tropical country. And there's been an unprecedented epidemic of chikungunya, which is a tropical mosquito-borne disease, which has made many, many people ill, over a third of the population, according to the Cuban Ministry of Health. And people are just thinking, we need the state to come around and pick up the rubbish.
Well, Ed, you mapped it out really nicely there. Oil deficit, garbage trucks don't do the collection, health impacts ensue, mosquito-borne diseases. What are people doing to cope? Leaving the country.
Cuba over the last few years has gone through an unprecedented, historic mass exodus. At least 10% of the population has left the country within the last 5 years.
With the intense and increased scrutiny for migrants at U.S. borders, where are those Cubans going when they leave the country?
It always used to be very, very easy for Cubans to get to the United States. That's now changed under the current Trump administration. Now the main route has closed down. Many Cubans are going to Mexico, many are going to Spain, many are going to a series of other countries.
So back on the oil tip, are there many gas stations in Cuba open these days?
No. And the lines outside the gas stations that are open have gotten noticeably bigger in recent days because Cubans are following the news, of course. Last week, for example, it was reported that the Trump administration is considering a total naval blockade of the island. Mexico, now the main country sending petroleum to Cuba, is under heavy pressure to stop.
Yeah, how much pressure is Mexico facing from Washington to stop those oil shipments to Cuba? Do we know?
Claudia Sheinbaum has repeatedly emphasized Mexican sovereignty and that it's Mexico and only Mexico that will make the decision of whether or not they're going to send more oil to Cuba. She characterizes the oil shipments as humanitarian aid, but it's worth noting that thousands of Cuban doctors and nurses work in Mexican hospitals. The thing is, for Claudia Sheinbaum, she is under pressure. She's under pressure from the United States. She has to renew a trade deal. And so the US has a huge amount of structural power, as we're seeing all over the world, but particularly in Latin America, to make its will felt and to influence decisions.
So humanitarian oil is coming from Mexico with the possibility that Cuba's current stock of oil will run out in a matter of days. Who else can the regime in Havana turn to?
There's no other country in the world that is willing to send the amounts of oil that Cuba needs. Very important to understand. The Cuban state is all but bankrupt. It cannot buy the amount of oil it needs on the international market because it simply doesn't have the cash. Secondly, the United States has been commandeering at gunpoint Venezuelan oil deliveries that were arriving at Cuba during December. Russia talks a big game, and it has sent oil deliveries, but it hasn't sent any oil to Cuba for months. And over the last few years, as a percentage of oil that Cuba needs, it's been small. Algeria, a similar story. Angola, a similar story. Clearly, China has the money to be able to step in and help. But whether or not the Chinese are wanting to pick a fight like this in a continent so far away from where they are isn't clear.
Ed, let's play out the oil and pressure narrative. There was this recent exclusive in the Wall Street Journal saying that Washington is actively seeking regime change in Cuba by the end of this year. President Trump certainly seems to think so. This is Trump speaking with reporters on Tuesday.
Cuba will be failing pretty soon. Cuba is really a nation that's very close to failing. You know, they got their money from Venezuela. They got the oil from Venezuela. They're not getting that anymore.
The Wall Street Journal piece said Cuban exiles and civic groups in Miami and Washington were working to identify officials inside the current government in Cuba who want to cut a deal. What are you hearing from Cubans in terms of what could come next?
If you speak to many Cubans on the street, they'd say the country has already failed. But there's a big difference between a country failing and the US managing to get a Washington-aligned government in Cuba. And it's that jump from driving down living standards on the one hand to getting a political transition on the other that US governments have never been able to explain how they're going to do. Some analysts call it magical thinking, this presumption that if you can collapse an economy, you'll almost magically, hey presto, get the government you want. Cuba's a one-party state, and most of the political dissidents in the last few years have decided to leave the island. It's just not clear where they would get their insider figure from the top that they're saying they want to get, and that it looks very clear that they were able to get in the case of Venezuela.
That was journalist Ed Augustin speaking with us from Havana. We'll hear voices from Venezuela later in the show.
The world has also been watching the news from Minneapolis. Agents from ICE have been on the city's streets since December. Public outrage over their tactics has escalated dramatically after immigration and customs enforcement officers killed 2 citizens. The world's Sarah Hassan was in Minneapolis at the height of the tensions this past weekend to meet Somalis and Somali Americans living there.
Carmel Mall is the place to go if you're in Minneapolis and you need some Somali clothes, Somali tea, or a Somali barber. There are coffee stalls and food stalls, and the sizzling chicken smells good. There's even an adjoining mosque for Muslim shoppers to offer their daily prayers. But many of the stalls here are closed, with big silver padlocks keeping people out. That's because some of the shop owners are too afraid to leave their homes. This woman has a small boutique in the mall.
People are afraid to come here. Almost all of us are U.S. citizens, but nobody wants to be harassed. We see what's going on and how people, U.S. citizens, are getting literally kidnapped, dragged. Nobody wants to experience that.
Like just about everyone I meet at the mall, she agrees to talk, but only on the condition that we not share her name. She fears for her safety, just like the shop owners staying home right now.
Our aunties and grandmas who have been here like 20, 30 years, who had stores when Carmel was the old Carmel, their doors are closed because they're so scared.
This is a running theme. The next day, I stopped by a Somali restaurant that was closed and a mosque that was mostly empty. I went to a community center next door to the mosque where an unannounced visit from a stranger, even a stranger in a headscarf, triggered panic. One frightened woman asked me to leave, which I understood. It was a traumatic day. Just a couple of hours earlier, a second U.S. citizen, Alex Preddy, had been shot and killed by ICE in the city. Everyone was on edge. But as I was leaving, a young woman approached me to share her thoughts.
Today, it's just been fear. Leaving this house this morning, even my parents were telling me, call off work. Everybody's in high alerts, scared, and just really scared for what's going to happen next in this community.
She said she appreciates the support Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey and Governor Tim Walz have shown for the Somali community, but she doesn't think they've gone far enough.
It's just giving a lot of talk and not enough actions.
There's another problem, too. It's hard to know what help you can trust. She says members of the Somali community are receiving messages warning them that some campaigns offering food or other support are actually coming from ICE to trick them into providing their locations. She showed me one message she'd received along those lines that looked like it had come from a local public school. I reached out to Minneapolis Public Schools, and they could not confirm any of the information in the message, but said their typical approach is to encourage families to reach out to them. The confusion around what's real and what's not contributes to a bigger sense of fear. Hodan Diri is a U.S. citizen who came to Minneapolis from the suburbs to do some shopping.
My area know any Somali stores. That's why I come all the way over here to Minneapolis.
She says her kids didn't want her to come.
They say, don't go. That is very dangerous place this time.
The Somali community, along with other targeted groups like the Hmong and Latino communities in Minneapolis, have seen their fellow Minnesotans show up for them. The rest of the world has seen that too, in footage of protests and a statewide strike, all while temperatures were hitting negative degrees. Flyers around town said, no work, no school, no shopping, ICE out. Imam Yusuf Abdullah, executive director of the Islamic Association of North America, spoke at a rally at the end of Friday's march where leaders of the indigenous, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities gathered in solidarity. He called it a historic day.
A day when federal government tried to divide us, and Minnesota said no.
He thanked Minnesota.
Today we are not gathered out of fear. We're gathered out of love for our neighbors, for our children, and for our future.
I asked him about the Trump administration's justifications for targeting Somali Americans in Minneapolis, including allegations that members of the community had been involved in fraud schemes.
Fraud is colorless. It does not depend on a community, on a color of person, on a language, on a background. It is a crime that is committed by an individual or individuals. And how many Somalis living in the state of Minnesota? All of them are fraudsters? That does not make sense. It is a collective punishment.
Abdullah says the raids are indiscriminate and based on profiling.
Doesn't matter if they have papers, if they are citizens, if they're born here or not. Some of our kids who were born here were roughed up. Some of them detained. Some of them stopped. For what? Just being a Somali descendant.
Minnesota Senator Omar Fateh represents District 62. He is of Somali descent and was born in Washington, D.C. He says in some ways, his hands are tied.
A lot of times when there are immigration issues that folks are experiencing, as a state senator, I can't do much around that.
But he is working on bringing back legislation he'd proposed in 2024, along with Representative Sandra Feist, that would have prevented the use of Minnesota state resources for federal immigration enforcement. It was called the North Star Act, and it didn't make it across the finish line.
I had a legislation 2 years ago called the North Star Act, which would have essentially been a sanctuary state policy bill for the state of Minnesota so that law enforcement cannot collaborate with ICE, so that ICE cannot go into our homeless shelters or to find data on our homeless populations. Also, for example, ICE cannot go into our public schools and get private data from our students. So that legislation would have protected against that, and I want to bring that back also this year.
But for now, that's not the law. And in Carmel Mall, a slow trickle of Somali customers may be showing up for haircuts, but a whole lot more are playing it safe at home. For The World, I'm Sara Hassan.
The North Sea is known for oil and gas, but a new project on the horizon is all about wind power. This is The World. This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. 10 European countries this week announced plans to supercharge offshore wind development in the North Sea. This is a big project that eventually would have enough turbines to power around 143 million homes. We're taking a closer look at this for today's installment of The Big Fix, where we dig into the most ambitious efforts underway to deal with climate change. Rebecca Williams is the Deputy CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, a trade group that represents many of the companies involved in the project. We spoke earlier today, and Williams explained that in the past, countries would set ambitious targets for offshore wind projects and then fail to meet them.
But what's different about this deal is that it's really putting in place the right conditions then to really be able to build out offshore wind. So the important thing here is this 15 gigawatts of offshore wind per year. And if you think of it in this way, 1 gigawatt powers roughly like 1 million homes. So that's 15 million when we're talking about gigawatts. So really, really a lot of potential there per year. The reason that that's so significant is that it means that all the supply chain companies in Europe can really see per year exactly what's going to happen in the future. And so that's really good from an investor perspective of knowing what's coming down the line and giving you the confidence that you're going to get that return on your investment.
So you have a guaranteed buyer of, for example, your turbine blades, so you're willing to make the huge investments it takes to set up the facilities to produce more of them.
That's right. I mean, if you're trying to build out a factory or you're thinking of opening a new part of a factory, obviously that's a huge investment, and you're going to have to be certain that in the future you're going to be able to have the market for that product. Just like if you are, selling shoes or something like that, you want to make sure that in the future you've got your market to sell those products into. So that's one thing. But I think the other thing here is also around these government contracts. So if we look at the UK, it's been really successful as a world-leading country when it comes to offshore wind. And one of the reasons it's been so successful is because it has this policy mechanism called the Contract for Difference. And basically, this is an investment contract between government and between the industry and the private sector. And it really gives you a kind of clear view of how power will be used in the future. So that mechanism has become really popular with investors. It's a kind of contract that investors now really understand.
And again, it gives them certainty about how much power is going to be bought in the future.
That's right. I think the other thing to note here is that in Europe, we have seen in the past few years, we saw some failed auctions for offshore wind. So offshore wind, like with other big infrastructure projects, is mainly bought or facilitated by auctions for that power. So it's like a government procurement auction, and different companies can bid into these auctions.
And a failed auction means what? Nobody wanted
that no one wanted
the plot of
to
land.
Bid. That's right. Yeah, that no one wanted to bid. So what we saw in the UK, Denmark, and Germany in particular was a series of these failed auctions, mainly because the frameworks weren't quite right. Things after COVID changed in terms of supply chain costs, and those auctions were not really responding to those changing circumstances. However, what's really good about this deal is now the governments who have had those auctions have really rolled up their sleeves, and have changed things around in order to make a better investment framework. So now what we're seeing is that different governments in this region are now committing to use this contract for difference model that has been so successful and popular with investors in the UK. And I think that's a really good turning point in the industry, and shows that governments really backing offshore wind here and willing to kind of work together with industry to get the right solutions on the table.
I'm speaking with Rebecca Williams, Deputy CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council. Rebecca, I want to zoom out now and talk about offshore wind in general. Overall, it has been a rough year for the industry. The International Energy Agency just revised its estimate for how much offshore wind would be built in the next 5 years, down by 25%, which is significant. What are the big hurdles leading to these challenges?
So I think we have seen a few years in the offshore wind sector that have been a bit choppy, that's for sure. And some of that has also played out in the US and on the US East Coast. And that has affected global investment in offshore wind. But I think standing at the beginning of 2026, actually, we do see now that offshore wind Is it a turning point, a positive turning point? Looking more globally and looking at some of what's happening away from Europe and away from the US, I think what's really exciting is that we're now starting to see offshore wind growing in countries where it's not traditionally been done before. So the story of offshore wind so far has definitely been a European and a Chinese success story. But what we're starting to see now is in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Japan, Korea, and also Brazil in Latin America, that more and more countries are looking to offshore wind to power their economic future. So I think that the world is carrying on despite some of the challenges that we've seen in the US sector.
Right, although that is a big counterpoint, right? The U.S. Development is likely to go down significantly due to federal policies.
Yeah, there have been significant challenges in the US offshore wind market, which are really well documented. I'm really hoping that, we can push through that in the US. But actually, what I'm saying is that in the rest of the world, we are seeing a lot of progress and we're seeing momentum in new parts of the world when it comes to offshore wind. So the US is not the only factor of this story. And actually, we see a lot of other countries just cracking on with getting to the next stage of their energy system.
We have seen costs come down dramatically for solar energy, specifically, PV panels, making it cheaper in most places than fossil fuels. Why have we not seen these same decreases for offshore wind, or at least at the same scale?
I mean, actually, we have seen really good cost decreases for offshore wind. So when you build a new technology out at scale, the investment environment that you can create does then lead to cost reduction. So if we look at what's happened in the UK, I mean, the history of offshore wind development there has been around that cost reduction piece. That's what we've seen also in China, where offshore wind has been deployed in large amounts and at scale. So
it is still a lot more expensive than solar, though.
But I think, if we look at offshore wind versus other comparators, so given that it is providing this kind of more baseload style, if you compare it to new gas plants or to new nuclear or to other forms of electricity, the comparison point there is very favorable. And actually, there's been a lot of research that is around the bill savings that consumers will have due to the build out of offshore wind versus other alternative technologies.
So I want to end here returning to the North Sea Wind Project. What impact would it have on the larger offshore industry, if it does go ahead successfully? As you've mentioned, this sort of certainty of purchasing is a big part of bringing down costs going forward.
Yeah, I think it has a really positive effect on the wider global industry. It's a huge doubling down by European countries on offshore wind as a technology, as on offshore wind as an industrial vehicle as well, and an industry in its own right. So really exciting moment, and it does provide that blueprint, I think, for cooperation when it comes to offshore wind.
Rebecca Williams is with the Global Wind Energy Council. She spoke with us from London. This is The World.
This is The World. I'm Marco Werman. The Trump administration says that for the foreseeable future, it is running Venezuela. This will not be easy. In addition to the difficulty of keeping tabs on a foreign country with about 30 million people, Venezuela is crowded with armed groups. They range from Colombian guerrillas to gold mining gangs and armed urban militias. Among the most talked about are the pro-government civilian groups called colectivos or collectives. The World's Tibisay Zea reports from the Venezuelan capital, Caracas.
It's a hot and busy afternoon in downtown Caracas. Among government buildings, one smaller place stands out. Its walls are covered in murals of Hugo Chavez, the founder of Venezuela's socialist revolution. Inside, a narrow hallway. The national TV channel hums in the background. Upstairs, on the second floor, a man who goes by Commander Navas is waiting for me.
Bueno, mira, mi nombre es Jorge Navas, soy el responsable del colectivo Resistencia y Rebelión.
Navas says he's the head of a colectivo called Resistance and Rebellion. part of a larger network of revolutionary groups dedicated to, as they say, protecting Venezuela against Western imperialism. He stands up from his desk and shows me his office.
Aquí este es nuestro comando. Mira, aquí tenemos fotos alusivas del comandante Che Guevara.
A large portrait of Che Guevara.
Tenemos una memoria aquí de nuestro presidente Nicolás Maduro. Mira, nuestro comandante eterno, Simón Bolívar.
Photos of Nicolás Maduro, Hugo Chavez, and Simón Bolívar, Venezuela's independence hero. Then he shows me a pile of books.
Todos estos libros, mira, aquí tenemos a Lenin.
There is Lenin, Marx, revolutionary texts, titles he calls essential reading for any Venezuelan. He says reading shapes political awareness and protects people from being manipulated. Navas was part of a Venezuelan communist guerrilla group back in the 70s and 80s.
Me fui involucrando porque me pareció interesante la conformación de los diferentes partidos comunistas.
He says he was drawn in by world wars, communist movements, and what he describes as Western attacks on the left.
Fuimos al Líbano, fuimos al Salvador, a conocer lo que era la lucha armada.
Navas says he trained abroad with left-wing groups, traveling to Lebanon, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, learning what he calls armed struggle. He rejects any accusation that colectivos are criminals.
Esta narrativa que impone la derecha extrema, ¿verdad? De que somos delincuentes, asaltadores.
He says it's false that they intimidate residents or patrol the streets, and says that narrative has been promoted by the far right. He insists their work today focuses on political education, teaching history, running workshops, and keeping revolutionary ideas alive. But researchers who have tracked colectivos for decades tell a different story. Venezuelan criminologist Roberto Briceño has spent years interviewing their leaders.
Los colectivos son una derivación de la guerrilla venezolana.
Colectivos existed and were armed before Hugo Chavez came to power. But once he was president, Briceño says his government embraced them.
Chávez decide que los quiere cooptar y efectivamente los empieza a financiarlos fuertemente.
Briceño says Chavez gave them money, media outlets, buildings, and control over territory. He says the government allowed them to carry weapons with little consequence. It's difficult to know exactly how many colectivo members there are, but most likely, Briceño says, at least a few thousand. Over time, many colectivos became useful during protests, according to Briceño.
Les son útiles porque cuando habían manifestaciones eran los que actuaban.
Cracking down on dissent, intimidating residents.
It's very convenient for governments who want to intimidate their opponents to have civilian enforcers who can instill fear.
Phil Gunson is a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group based in Venezuela. He says armed civilian groups can do the dirty work the police is not supposed to do.
Because they were given not only weapons and motorcycles and radios, but they were granted a large measure of impunity. And of course, people with guns who know that they're not going to be prosecuted will inevitably turn to crime.
He says that protection helped push some colectivos into illicit businesses, from extortion to fuel and food smuggling. Another colectivo member I met, Alejandro Coito, insisted his group exists to defend Venezuela's sovereignty.
Nuestro presidente hoy es un prisionero de guerra. Imagínate.
He calls Maduro a prisoner of war and says there should be no elections in Venezuela until he comes back. And when I ask about the government now responding to U.S. pressure, he says it's just a strategy to survive by buying time. What happens to colectivos if Venezuela enters a political transition is an open question. There are some who worry these groups could concentrate in certain neighborhoods and create these gang-like strongholds. But Roberto Briceño is slightly more hopeful.
Yo les dejaría a los colectivos, ustedes quieren tener un concejal, tengan su tarjeta electoral y vayan
He
a las
says
elecciones.
if state money dries up and democratic space opens, some colectivos could fade or even turn to politics. Either way, colectivos are only one of several armed forces that could complicate Venezuela's transition. For the World, I'm TV Saisea, Caracas, Venezuela.
In Syria, the end of the civil war just over a year ago prompted hundreds of thousands of refugees to return to their home country. Turkey took in more Syrian refugees than any other country in the world, and Turkish companies are now dependent on Syrian workers. With many of them heading back home now, it's become a major headache. Nowhere more so than in the industrial city of Gaziantep, close to the Syrian border. Reporter Dorian Jones visited the city.
The Inja Boya Company is one of hundreds of small factories and workshops operating in Gaziantep. With a couple of dozen workers, hundreds of pieces of furniture are spray painted each day. The long hours in the air thick with dust are arduous and dirty work. Like many factories in the city, Syrians make up much of the workforce, as owner Halil Yarabe explains.
İnsanları getirip kendi sektöründe çalıştıramıyorum.
I can't get people from my own community to work in my sector. And many workshop owners and many businesses are unfortunately experiencing this. I mainly blame our own society, our own people, our children, our youth. They consider such work beneath them. They consider they fail in their families' eyes by working with their hands as a furniture maker or a mechanic. Look, it's almost 100% Syrians here.
Atölyede çalışan Suriyeliler var.
But many Syrians are now returning. In Gaziantep, over 100,000 have already left, including several from this factory. During a welcome tea break, returning home is on the lips of the workers. Ahmed Hach Hussein has been working here for over 5 years. He, too, is thinking of leaving.
Many people are returning. I have a relative who moves a family back to Syria every day. For me, I lived in Aleppo for 35 years. I have so many friends there. I haven't seen them for 14 years. My brother went back to Aleppo, but he says business is too slow.
But Ahmed's son, Ibrahim, who started working here a year ago after leaving school, doesn't want to go.
I grew up here. This place became my second home. I do love it here a lot. I was 2 years old when I came here and never went back. I don't want to go back.
For Turkish companies like Inja Boya, they'll be hoping many Syrians think like Ibrahim, says Attila Yeşilada. He's Turkey's economic analyst for Global Source Partners. Yeşilada says Syrians are key for small factories and businesses across Turkey and will continue to be so, given the demographic time bomb Turkey is facing.
Up to 900,000 out of 4 million Syrians find employment in Turkey. They filled all the low-paying jobs. Business people have indicated that without Syrians, they'll go bankrupt because that's what really keeps costs down.
Söylediğim bir söz var. En az 3 çocuk diyorum.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan making an appeal this month for families to serve the nation and have more children. While his family minister claimed nearly half of the families didn't have children. In a bid to draw workers, visa and work permit restrictions were lifted last year on Turkic nations of Central Asia. But at Inja Boya Company, its owner Yarabe is already counting the cost of Syrians leaving, claiming a bidding war to keep workers has started.
İlk gidişler başladı.
As the departures continue, I think we will have a lot of problems with our dependency on Syrians. Because as soon as the first return started, labor inflation started to rise here. Our employees, who we used to employ at 10,000 Turkish lira per week, have gone up to 12, 13, and now 15,000.
But for larger companies in Gaziantep, like Tat Holding, which makes furniture, sweets, as well as many other products, they are considering following their workers back to Syria, says CEO Salih Balta.
It is logistically very close to Gaziantep and offers us the opportunity to both produce and export at a cost reduced by up to 35%.
2 years ago, Gaziantep, along with many other cities across Turkey, witnessed protests against Syrians. Many polls found that the majority of people want them to return. But with nearly 1 million returning, it could well prove a double-edged sword, as businesses face growing economic pain at the loss of their workers. Dorian Jones, Gaziantep.
Dorian reported that story for DW's Inside Europe. You can hear more from the program wherever you get your podcasts.
There are all kinds of ways to attract a big following on social media. Ian Anderson has come up with an interesting one.
Welcome back to another episode of Being Unemployed with Ian. In the last episode, we escaped Iran. Now we're in Baku, Azerbaijan. We need to figure out how the hell to get to Japan from here.
Escaping Iran onto Azerbaijan and then finally Japan, all on a bicycle. The 32-year-old American began his bike trip in Portugal. As the world's Jeremy Siegel reports, Anderson's journey has highlighted how perceptions abroad toward the United States and its people have changed in the past year.
Last February, Ian Anderson had quit his construction job and wanted a total change of pace. So the Minnesota native set off on an ambitious journey from the western edge of Portugal to the easternmost part of Japan. His mom joined him for the first leg.
They say you should spend Valentine's Day with somebody that you love. So I'm biking across Europe with my mom. She told me to put sunscreen on today, and I ignored her. And now I'm severely sunburned, so that's great.
Sunburn aside, the ride across Europe was mostly smooth sailing. But in June, as Anderson was making his way across the Middle East, everything changed.
Overseas now, attacks by Israel on Iran are expanding. And so
at the time, Anderson was traveling through Iran with a government-required guide. When Israel launched strikes on nuclear facilities and other targets in the country, his guide told him he could no longer protect him and advised Anderson not to tell anyone he was American.
The situation is quite dire at this point. All the land borders are closed. Flights have all been canceled. Iranians now see U.S. as being tied directly to Israel. Before I went to sleep last night, I did see a bunch of comments, messages while the social media was still working. Just appreciate all of you for sharing your well wishes and strength and all that good stuff.
Anderson had to halt his journey for 2 days as he sheltered north of Tehran before escaping to Iraq and carrying on towards Russia, Mongolia, and China, a grueling route that involved biking through freezing desert and steep, mountainous terrain.
I have selected some countries that are a bit more off the beaten trail, a bit more when you look at them why are you going there? It looks ridiculous. Too dangerous in some cases. And I do try to lean into that a little bit, follow my curiosity and face my fears. That's kind of one of the things I try to show.
Speaking on a recent evening from his hotel room in China, Anderson tells me he's been surprised by the kindness of strangers he's encountered on the trip. That includes an Iranian restaurant that refused to allow him to pay for a meal, and a Russian who was driving down a large mountain that Anderson was going up and stopped in his tracks to lend Anderson a hand.
He turned around, did a 180, came up to me, rolled his window down. He's like, "Hey, hold on to my car. I'll pull you to the top." And literally pulled me for maybe 20, 30 minutes, up to the top of the mountain. And we just had a really nice chat, the entire time, learning about Russia. He was asking me about my trip. We said goodbye at the top, and then he turned around and kept going.
Other encounters haven't been so amicable, Anderson tells me. Some of that owing to the fact that he often flies an American flag on the back of his bike. Things did not go well when he did that a few days ago as he rode out of Beijing.
2 minutes in, less than 2 minutes in, some guy pulled up. He's like, "Hey, are you from America?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm from America. What do you think about America?" And he's on a moped. He's like, "F you, America," and speeds off.
But that's part of the appeal of Anderson's journey. He's gained hundreds of thousands of followers, some of whom help support his trip, thanks to his willingness to engage with strangers, no matter the situation, and his somewhat impromptu planning, which recently left him stranded in Mongolia's capital because he couldn't get approved for a visa to enter China.
I've been stuck in Mongolia for over a month now. It's cold, man. It's lonely out here. Too much time to think. Anyways, waiting around, I went on a Bumble date, and I got stood up.
His trip and his candid descriptions of travel hiccups and local culture have caught the attention of other ultra-long-distance cyclists across the world.
I've enjoyed catching up on Ian's incredible journeys. I loved what he shared about the Iranian people and the culture there. I share that, having cycled through Iran.
That's Mark Beaumont, a Scottish cyclist who holds the world record for biking around the globe.
I think he's doing a great job as an ambassador, a global traveler, and he's showing a lot of kindness, and he's been met by a lot of kindness. So well done him.
Beaumont is what you might consider one of the OG ultracyclists. He tells me a couple decades ago when he documented his global biking trips, it involved massive crews for filming, production, and distribution. Beaumont's enjoyed seeing how in the age of social media, a single person like Anderson can bring the entire world along for his ride just using a phone.
It's not necessarily that everybody wants to go bike across the world, but maybe inspires them a little bit just to think about it differently and maybe make a change of their own, just something that scares them.
Cycling to Japan, Anderson says, is just the beginning, and later this year, he plans to bike across Antarctica. For The World, I'm Jeremy Siegel.
This is The World. I'm Carolyn Beeler. The price of gold hit a new record high today, nearly $5,600 an ounce, before dropping off just a little. Investors tend to flock to gold during tumultuous times, and other than sending the price skyrocketing, we were curious what other impacts that has. Daniel McDowell is a political scientist at Syracuse University.
I think there's a couple things that investors tend to think when they think about gold. This includes institutional investors like central banks, all the way down to individual retail investors like you and I, which is that gold is a safe place to be in times of crisis. It's a good hedge against instability. And it's also a good place to be when other major currencies, in particular the dollar, which is the world's most important currency, tend to get weaker or lose value. Gold historically tends to rise relative to that.
Do we know how long we have stored value in gold or considered it a form of currency?
Well, certainly there's evidence of human societies using gold as jewelry, as a sign of opulence and wealth, going back around 5,000, even 6,000 years. So it has a really long history in human societies. In terms of its use in currency, even that goes back thousands of years to Roman times and then all the way up until the early 20th century and even into the post-war period where the dollar was fixed to gold.
This is kind of a meta question, I guess, because, why does anything we use as currency have value? But is there anything special about gold and why we consider it so valuable?
Yeah, I mean, the things that people typically point to are, one, gold is scarce. And so generally speaking, humans, we tend to find things that are scarce in scarce supply to be more valuable than things that are plentiful, that are very easy to get. Gold's difficult to acquire, right? It takes a lot of time, a lot of money to dig it out of the ground. And so that's another factor. You can't just easily create more gold. And so there's not only is it in short supply to begin with, there's an understanding that the supply is not going to increase dramatically. And then lastly, it's beautiful. This bright yellow metal, it can be mixed with other metals and made into very durable, long-lasting jewelry. There's a sense of eternity that's tied up into gold, and I think that's part of its appeal too.
So there's a bit of the romance there in addition to the economics principles.
Yes.
So I want to follow the supply chain of gold here and ask what happens when the price skyrockets, starting with mining.
Sure.
Are gold miners really kicking into high gear all around the world right now?
Well, for sure. Look, mining is like any other industry. It's going to respond to financial incentives. And so when the price of gold goes up, we're seeing interest, for instance, even from countries. China is in talks to purchase a gold mine in Canada right now. So you're seeing government interest in getting into the mining space as well, which I think reflects that rising price as well.
So I have always been curious, if people are buying gold, does that mean it's getting like loaded up onto planes and getting shipped all over the world to be transferred from a Swiss bank vault to somebody's home safe, something like that?
Certainly there is some physical movement from time to time. Large stocks of gold are custodied in certain places. There's a lot of gold that's custodied with the New York Fed, for instance. That's mostly sort of official government reserves. There's a lot of gold that's custodied in London as well. But obviously, you've got major refineries, places like Switzerland. There's also black markets for gold in different places around the world. And so at times, yes, it is moving, but I think probably less of that than we might imagine. A lot of it is just sort of shifting who owns gold that might be housed in a particular custodian location.
So you might buy gold, but it stays exactly where it is in the current vault, and the person who used to own it just doesn't have the paperwork to prove that they own it anymore. You now do.
Exactly. For instance, commercial banks will hold physical stocks of gold, and then will be able to sell access to that gold to their clients. And so it might be that one client of the bank sells their ownership rights over that gold to another. It doesn't actually move one location. It's just who has the title to own it. That doesn't mean there aren't actual physical movements of gold. That does happen too, but probably less than we think of. Every time gold is bought and sold doesn't mean it's getting picked up and flown somewhere else in the world.
Clearly, I have never invested in gold before. Don't know how this all works. What about, when people buy gold and store it themselves? That does seem like they would need to actually put it on a plane and ship it. Where does it come from?
This has absolutely been something that's been happening over the last several years as interest in holding gold has risen. There's really kind of two markets. There's the physical gold market, which you're just asking about here. And these are folks who really want to buy 1 ounce ingots of gold and have them stored physically in a vault that is, in their home or in their business somewhere. In those cases, it might be that mines that are producing the gold are then shipping the unrefined gold to Switzerland, where it's being refined and purified, packaged, and then sold and physically flown from Europe to the United States. And so that could be one sort of pathway.
So gold is also a material. It is used in technology these days, like smartphones. Is the high price right now impacting the supply chain for electronics or other stuff that includes gold as a material?
It's definitely causing, I think, some industries that rely on it, I would put silver in this category as well, to look for alternatives if they can. There may not always be an obvious alternative, but to the extent that you can say sub in something like copper instead of silver or instead of gold, then that might be appealing at a time when prices are so high. The only thing I would add there is that prices of a lot of these metals and commodities right now are kind of moving in kind. So even though copper is cheaper than silver by a long mile and much cheaper than gold, copper prices are up quite a bit now too. So all of these things right now are quite expensive.
You know a lot about this topic. Was there something that first got you interested in learning more about gold and its role in finance?
I'm mostly interested in international currencies and the role that the dollar plays in the world. And so part of that is being a student of history and understanding the dollar's evolving role over the last 100 years or so. And you have to understand the historic link between the dollar and gold. And you can go back again even further and think about the central role that gold had played in the international monetary system. And more recently, I became interested in central bank demand for gold, which has really been increasing over the last 15 years or so for various reasons. Part of that was a response to U.S. sanctions. And so we might note that Russia found that a lot of its U.S. Treasury holdings and Eurobond holdings were blocked or frozen after the invasion of Ukraine. But Russia also had a sizable amount of gold, physical gold in its own vaults. And of course, those investments were safe. And so this idea of gold being apolitical and something that is a shield against the weaponization of sovereign currencies is something that's fascinating to me.
Political science professor Daniel McDowell of Syracuse University talking us through the latest global gold rush.
The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio in Boston and from the Department of Communication at UC San Diego.
Find us online anytime at theworld.org or on YouTube, and be sure to subscribe to our channel there. It's called The World News Radio. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. Thank you for listening. Join us again right back here tomorrow.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. LuminaFoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Judy Piggott, the Gruber Family Foundation, the Schmidt Family Foundation, and Gavin Salmonese, LLC. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.
PRX.